With me is David Mitchell, State Director for AARP in the state of Arizona. Thank you very much for making the time to join me in this important interview about AARP.
Well, David, it's my pleasure to be with you because I enjoy talking about AARP.
Great. I understand that you have been with AARP for 27 years, and I'm going to ask perhaps the last question first. Okay. Would you do this all over again?
Absolutely, without a doubt. This is a great place to work. It's a great place to serve because we have a great organization.
I would like to ask you, if you would, to give us a little history of AARP from its beginnings until the time you basically come on board with AARP.
Well, AARP came into existence in 1958. Dr. Ethel Percy Andrus was our founder back in 1958. And in 1960, just 2 years later, she started the very first AARP chapter that gave members of AARP an opportunity to gather together not only for fellowship, but also to learn and also to serve in their community as volunteers and be leaders in their communities, particularly in areas related to aging, related to legislation, related to things that affected people over the age of 50. And that was in 1960, and we in Arizona can claim chapter number 1. And 50 years later, chapter number 1 is still in existence, still serving its community, still producing leadership. And that's what makes it real exciting to be part of AARP. But that was back in 1960. A lot has happened over the last 50 years since that first chapter was founded. You'll notice that in 1965 was the year that Medicare came into existence. Now, Dr. Andrus had great influence when she was back in Washington, D.C. during that time in the beginning of Medicare. So in 1965, just 5 years after that first chapter was formed, you'll notice the influence of AARP chapters not only in Arizona but all across the country in legislative issues, and in particular the founding of Medicare. You move on a little bit further than that, and you'll see that AARP continued to grow. There were offices that were opening all over the country, actually. Dr. Andrus started in California. She eventually moved to Washington, D.C., where we had our national office. But then we began to open offices in various places around the country. When I came to AARP back in 1983, several things had already transpired that really motivated me in doing the kind of work that I do. One was the fact that, as I believe you understand, that Dr. Andrus not only founded AARP in 1958, but prior to that, 11 years prior to that, in 1947, she founded the National Retired Teachers Association. Now, up until the year 1982, there were two separate boards that actually directed the work of the individual organizations. In 1982, those two boards merged together and one board was founded. And so that was just a year prior to my coming to AARP in 1983. And so AARP began to really evolve once that took place. As a matter of fact, what I found very interesting is back in as early as 1969, now this is 2 years after Dr. Andrus passed away. In 1969, our then executive director, Bernie Nash, was coming into a board meeting. And as he moved into the room to conduct the board meeting, he heard several members of the board in conversation. And one of the things that came up in that conversation was the fact, if I knew back when I was younger what I know now, I would have done things a little bit differently in my retirement. That caused a spark to come to Bernie Nash, and the board began to deliberate, this is as early as 1969, that we really need to reach some people while they're still working, before they retire. So 2 years later, in 1971, AARP formed a sister organization called Action for Independent Maturity. And that organization, Action for Independent Maturity, and we called it AIM, after its initials AIM, was designed to reach out to people 50 years of age, because at that point in time, one had to be 55 years of age to become a member of AARP. So when AIM was founded, it was designed to reach people between the ages of 50 and 65.
So does that mean then that there were two organizations pretty much running at the same time?
Actually, there were three.
Three?
Because there was AARP, there was NRTA, and there was AIM.
Was there a way in which AIM communicated with its members?
Well, indeed, we did have our own magazine. It was called Dynamic Years. Now, when Dr. Andrus first began putting together a magazine, it was called Dynamic Maturity. That eventually evolved into Modern Maturity. But when AIM came into existence, we went back to that name Dynamic, and we called our magazine Dynamic Years. And so Dynamic Years was a magazine that was designed for members of AIM. And incidentally, back then, back in the early 1980s, it was $5 a year to be a member of AARP. But guess what? It was $6 a year to be a member of AIM. And we gave them a separate magazine, and also provided a lot of information and materials on how to get yourself ready for retirement and what to do later on once you were retired.
What triggered the termination, if you will, of this organization, and what happened to the staff that was working for AIM?
Well, what was interesting was the board of directors back actually in the December 1984 board meeting made the decision to actually merge AIM back into AARP. One of the things that was going on during those mid-'80s was a mini recession, and companies were no longer paying for their employees to go through a retirement preparation program. And so the materials that we were preparing, companies were no longer buying these materials, not because they weren't good materials, but because of the fact that they were in a recession mode, and so they were cutting out a lot of extra expense. So what happened was back in 1984, at the end of the year, the board merged the two organizations and then developed a new program under the auspices of AARP called Workforce Programs. So we carried on a lot of the same responsibilities with retirement preparation material and also employment planning material, but it was under the auspices of AARP. So we dropped the name AIM.
Now, you used to work for AIM, and when I knew you, in 2003, you were a state director. How did that happen? What transpired? Can you talk to us about the structure of AARP from regional office that you said earlier to the structures that we currently have?
Yes, I'll tell you, and it was an exciting time actually, because one of the things that we always tell our AARP staff, if you don't like change, AARP is not the place for you, because AARP changes, and it changes with the times. That's one thing that is so wonderful about our organization, because we respond to the needs of our members. And back in 1986, that was the last edition of Dynamic Years. So we put that magazine to bed, And that is when modern maturity actually developed into a number of issues. They began to put articles in modern maturity that related to the pre-retiree as well as for the retiree. Because as the baby boomers began to age, and now think of it right now, the baby boom generation, they turned 50 in 1996. They are turning 65 next year in 2011. So as AIM was absorbed back into AARP, AARP began to develop with the baby boomers. And so you will find that as we got into the early 90s, and our membership really began to grow. When I came to AARP in 1983, we had 14 million members. Nowadays, we have between 38 and 40 million members. So you can see how we have grown over those years. And because of the fact that the baby boom generation, they are growing along with us. So what happened, David, was not only were the two organizations merged, but then we began to grow along with the needs and wants of that dynamic, that age group. And included in that age group was information they wanted not only on retirement planning and financial planning, but also they wanted information on how they could contribute to their community, how they could be effective in their communities. They like to volunteer. And you'll see that as we got into the 90s, now here's something that a lot of people don't realize. Back in the late 90s, actually it was in 1998, the board of directors actually dropped our name, American Association of Retired Persons. A lot of people don't realize that. We are just known by the four initials AARP.
How did we evolve from regional office to state offices?
As you know, Dr. Andrus, what she wanted was for AARP to be relevant to its members where they lived. And it was very important for us to get to our members where they lived. Now, originally, regional offices, as a matter of fact, prior to their being called regional offices, they were called area offices, and they were in cities of the 10 federal regions. But what happened was we began to realize we need to put staff into the states so that we could be better servants to our members. So as early as 1987 is when our first state office came into existence. That was in Pennsylvania. In Harrisburg, Pennsylvania in 1987, our first state office came into existence. Now, it wasn't until later on in 1992 and 1993 that we began to take on other state offices gradually. California, New York, Ohio became state offices. And then in 1995, we actually had an explosion of state offices, and we ended up at the end of 1995 with 21 state offices. And then we began to open other state offices until the year 2002, and at the end of 2002, we had 53 state offices. Now, I know we only have 50 states, but there's one in every state, plus we have an office in the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands, giving us 53 state offices, accomplishing what Dr. Andrus set out to do, to get AARP relevant to its members so that we are in places where our members live.
David, but you miss an important state.